The excavation crew broke through the collapsed roof of the old rail tunnel at 11 minutes past midnight, and the first thing their lights found, 40 meters down in air that had not moved in 42 years, was a wall of steel crates stacked to the ceiling, each one stenciled in faded human lettering that the crew's field translator flagged, ran twice, and flagged again because the second pass agreed with the first and neither of them made any sense. Unknown philosophy, restricted archival, humanities. Provost-Marshal Draven Orsk came down the access shaft himself an hour later, boots ringing on rungs a human engineer had welded into the rock before Orsk's grandfather was born, and stood in the beam of his own lamp, reading the stencil 3 times before he let himself believe it. 42 years the Dominion had held this sector. 42 years of surveys, of confiscations, of archive sweeps that had turned every human university, every records office, every buried municipal vault on this stretch of coast inside out looking for exactly this kind of find. And in all that time, nobody had thought to look under a rail yard that every existing survey listed as collapsed, flooded, and empty since the war. It had taken a sinkhole opening under a resurfacing crew's excavator 2 days ago to find it. Pure accident. The kind of accident Orsk had learned not to trust and had decided, standing in that tunnel with the crates rising over his head like a wall built specifically to be broken through, to trust anyway. Provost-Marshal. Archivist Severin Dale came down the shaft behind him, older than Orsk by 2 full command cycles, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who had spent 30 years cataloging human material and had learned to be afraid of exactly this kind of silence. Before anything else moves, I want the tunnel logged and the crates photographed in place. There are markings on the access door we passed at the top of the shaft that I'd like translated before we touch anything further in. We don't have time for a full survey protocol, archivist. This installation predates the fall's final month. Whatever's down here was buried in the last days of the war, which means it was important enough to bury and not important enough to destroy first. That's not a coincidence. That's an oversight, and I intend to make use of it before someone above my pay grade decides the honor belongs to them. I'm not proposing a full survey. I'm proposing we read the door before we walk past it. Dale's lamp found the marking she meant, a stenciled plate bolted beside the access hatch, the paint chipped but legible, a warning glyph in the human military shorthand her office had spent 3 decades learning to read fluently enough to catch what the fast translators missed. She read it aloud, slower than the field translator had, checking each word against the last. Authorized personnel only. Unauthorized activation attempts will be logged and answered. There's a second line beneath it, smaller, harder to make out. I don't have a confident translation. It reads either, the ledger keeps its own accounts, or something closer to, the account keeps itself. And I would very much like a better linguist than either of us before we decide which. Orsk looked at the plate for a long moment, and something in him, the part of him that had clawed his way up through 11 years of garrison postings on worlds nobody in the Corps cared about, the part that had watched 3 separate provost marshals with better connections and worse instincts get promoted past him for fines a fraction the size of this one, made the decision before the cautious half of him finished forming an objection. Logged and answered, he said. By what archivist? There's no power signature down here. No active systems, no defense grid, nothing but 42 years of dead air and a warning label some frightened human clerk wrote to keep his own people out. I've read 1,000 of these placards. They all say the same thing in one dialect or another. It's theater. It's the only weapon a defeated species has left, the threat of a threat. He turned from the plate and looked back down the tunnel, at the crates, at the sheer stacked weight of whatever the humans had thought was worth burying this deep. Get me a full inventory by morning and a linguist better than either of us within the week. I want this material moved to secure registry storage inside the keep before word of it reaches anyone outside this crew. Whatever this is, archivist, it belongs to the officer who found it, and I found it. 200 kilometers from that tunnel, in a converted customs office on the third floor of the Dominion Registry building in the heart of occupied Port Meridian. Wren Calloway was 3 hours into a translation shift that had already run 4 hours over her contract when a runner from the archivist's office came through the door without knocking and told her, in the clipped, faintly excited voice of someone delivering an order they didn't fully understand, that she was needed on site at a recovery in the old rail yards before dawn. She was 19 years old, had been working Dominion Registry translation contracts for 3 of them, and had learned early, the way every human in Port Meridian learned early, the way you learned to breathe underwater or you drowned, that the correct response to any unexpected summons from the occupying authority was to look mildly inconvenienced and never, under any circumstance, look afraid. She looked mildly inconvenienced. She gathered her satchel, checked out through the desk sergeant with the flat, practiced courtesy that had gotten her through 3 years of exactly this kind of night, and did not let herself think about the words unknown philosophy until she was alone in the transport with nothing but a Dominion driver's back to watch and 40 minutes of dark coastal road to fill. She knew that phrase. She had known it her whole life, the way you know a word from a language you were never formally taught but absorbed anyway, sitting in a lap, listening to a voice read from a cracked leather notebook that had survived the fall in a wall cavity behind a stove because her grandmother had built it to survive there. Unknown philosophy, not a real classification. A joke, almost, in the gallows humor way her grandmother's generation had specialized in. A security header stamped on the outside of a program, so that the file, if it was ever recovered by exactly the kind of archive sweep crew that had been combing this coast for 4 decades, would be filed by an overworked cataloger under humanities instead of ordnance, would sit in the wrong stack for years, decades, forever if the design held. Mistaken for exactly what its label claimed it was, and nothing more. Wren Calloway had grown up believing that design had held. She had grown up believing her grandmother's last work had simply never been found, had rotted quietly in whatever hole Dr. Esme Calloway had buried it in during the final chaotic week of the fall, and that the not finding was itself a kind of victory, small and private and hers alone to know about, because nobody else in Port Meridian, not Priya, not the Registry, not the 3 generations of Dominion administration that had ruled this coast since, had ever once connected the Calloway name on her employment file to the initials EC that appeared, in a hand she recognized instantly and completely, on 11 pages of her grandmother's notebook describing a program that was never supposed to be found. The transport crested the last rise above the rail yards, and the crater of collapsed rail bed opened up below her in the pre-dawn floodlights, and Wren Calloway looked down at the mouth of the tunnel her grandmother had sealed with her own hands 42 years ago, and understood, with the specific cold clarity of someone watching a fact rearrange her entire life in real time, that the design had not held after all. She did not let any of it reach her face. That was the first and most important skill Priya had ever taught her, long before Priya had taught her anything about the resistance, about dead drops or coded transmissions, or which registry supervisors could be trusted with a half-truth, and which couldn't be trusted with any truth at all. A face was the first thing the occupation took from you if you let it, and the only thing you got to decide, every single day, was whether you handed it over or not. The recovery site was a controlled chaos of floodlights and cargo lifters when she arrived. Dominion engineers in yellow site hazard collars moving crates up the shaft on a jury-rigged winch, while Archivist Dale stood at the tunnel mouth with a translation tablet, and an expression Wren had learned, over 3 years of registry work, to read as genuine professional unease rather than performance. Dale did not waste time on pleasantries. "You're the linguist they sent. Good. I want your read on this before it goes into the official file, not the field translators." Dale turned the tablet so Wren could see the photograph of the plate beside the access hatch, the warning glyph, the second line whose translation Dale had flagged as uncertain. "Tell me honestly." Does that second line say the system keeps its own accounts, or does it say the account keeps itself? I need to know which, because one of those is a boast and the other is a warning, and my Provost-Marshal has already decided it's the boast. Wren looked at the photograph for exactly as long as a stranger reading unfamiliar military shorthand for the first time should need to look at it, which was longer than she actually needed, because she had read this line before, on page 9 of a notebook she had memorized before she was 12. It doesn't say either, she thought, with a steadiness that surprised even her. It says the ledger settles its own debts. But that translation required knowing what the ledger was, and admitting that would end this conversation in a way she could not survive. So she gave Dale something close enough to be useful and far enough from the truth to be safe. The grammar's ambiguous in a way that's probably deliberate, Wren said. Old human military writing does that on purpose sometimes, leaves a threat vague enough that you can't disprove it, can't plan around it. My best reading is closer to your second option, not a boast. A warning that whatever's down there doesn't need anyone standing guard over it to answer for itself. She kept her voice in the flat, professional register the Registry paid her for, the register that had gotten her through 3 years of translating her own people's grief and defiance into terms an occupying bureaucracy could file and forget. I'd want more context before I signed my name to it, archivist, but if I were advising caution, that's the line I'd point to. Dale looked at her for a moment longer than the answer strictly required, and Wren made herself hold the look without flinching, because flinching was the second thing Priya had taught her never to do. I'll pass that along, Dale said finally. For what it's worth, linguist, I agree with you. I don't think the Provost-Marshal wants to hear it, but I agree with you. By the time the last of the crates came up the shaft 2 hours later, in a fine, cold rain that had started sometime after Wren stopped tracking it, she had translated 11 separate warning placards, 4 crate manifests, and a single line of handwriting, pressed so faintly into a data slate's cracked casing that she doubted anyone else in the crew had even noticed it was there. That read, in a hand she would have known anywhere in the galaxy. If you're reading this and you're not supposed to be, put it back and walk away. It won't ask twice. She did not translate that line for Archivist Dale. She photographed it quietly, on a personal device she was not technically permitted to carry into a recovery site, and told herself the omission was professional discretion, and not the first outright act of resistance she had committed since she was 17 years old, and knew, even as she told herself that it was a lie she would need to get much more comfortable with before this was over. Priya Reyes ran a laundry 3 streets back from the Registry building, and had run it, publicly, for 11 years, long enough that even the Dominion administrators who used her pressing service twice a week had stopped thinking of her as anything other than a fixture of the block. Privately, she had run something else for exactly as long, a network so quiet and so patient that most of the people it protected never learned they'd been protected at all. And Wren had grown up inside that second, invisible laundry, the way other children grew up inside a family business, folding secrets instead of shirts. She found Priya in the back room past midnight, the steam presses cooling, and told her everything, the tunnel, the crates, the placard, the line pressed into the slate casing that only a Calloway would have recognized as her grandmother's hand, and watched Priya's face do the thing it did only rarely, which was go completely, carefully still. You're certain it's the ledger? I'm certain it's Grandma Esme's work. I've read that line before, Priya. Page 9 of her notebook, word for word, except she wrote "won't ask" twice, in ink, and someone stamped it into steel 42 years ago because she knew exactly what she was building and exactly how long it might have to wait. Wren kept her voice low, though the back room was as safe as anywhere in Port Meridian because some habits didn't care how safe a room was. They've got it, Priya. The whole installation. Crates, cores, whatever the archive stack actually is. It's going into secure registry storage inside the keep by end of week, and I've already been told I'm on the translation team assigned to it. Because I'm the only linguist in the building, with a security clearance that clears the old military dialect, and nobody's checked my last name against a 42-year-old personnel file, because why would they? Priya sat down slowly across the folding table, the way she sat when she needed a moment to arrange a fact into something she could work with instead of something that would flatten her. Corvin Ash, who had been leaning in the doorway through all of it with the particular stillness of a man who'd learned decades ago that the fastest way to be trusted with dangerous information was to look like he already had too much of his own to want more, came the rest of the way into the room and shut the door behind him. "Tell them both what you told me," Priya said. "The full history, not the notebook fragments you've been carrying around in your head since you were 12. All of it in order, so we're deciding on facts and not on what a 9-year-old understood about her grandmother's last project." Wren had told this story to herself so many times that saying it aloud felt strange, like reading a language she'd only ever spoken inside her own skull. Esme Calloway was chief systems ethicist on a joint military humanities program in the last 2 years of the war, she said. Not chief engineer. That mattered to her. She used to tell my mother the distinction was the whole point. The engineers built the hardware. She built the doctrine that decided what the hardware was allowed to do with itself. The program's real name doesn't survive anywhere I've ever found. Everyone who worked on it just called it the ledger, because that's what it did. It kept an account. Every atrocity logged against Earth during the war, every civilian target, every broken agreement, time-stamped, sourced, verified against multiple records, and weighted against a body of doctrine Esme spent 2 years writing herself. Proportional response theory, just cause, discrimination between combatant and civilian, everything humanity had ever worked out about when violence is answerable and when it's just cruelty with paperwork. The idea was never to build a bigger gun. Humanity didn't have room left for a bigger gun by the time the program started. The idea was to build something that could look at exactly what had been done to Earth, weigh it honestly and answer it precisely, not with annihilation, with justice, if the word still means anything after everything that's happened since. She used to say the whole point was restraint, that the ledger's real weapon wasn't force, it was judgment. It would only ever answer what could be proven, and only against who could be proven guilty, and nothing else. Not the cities, not the bystanders, not anyone who hadn't earned the account against their own name. "And the hardware," Corvin said. "The part that actually delivers whatever the ledger decides. That part I know less about because Esme's notebook is mostly the doctrine, not the engineering. She left the specifics to people she trusted more than she trusted paper. But there's one page near the back where she describes something she calls the correction platforms. Orbital assets, seeded in the last months of the war, disguised as battle debris so they'd never be swept up and destroyed by whoever won. She writes that if the war was lost, and by the time she was finishing this, everyone building it knew it was going to be lost, the platforms would stay dormant, indistinguishable from wreckage forever, unless the ledger itself was recovered, reactivated, and formally briefed. No briefing, no verdict. No verdict, no correction. It was built to do nothing at all unless someone forced it to do something, and even then, she writes, it wouldn't do anything blind. It would need testimony first, a live account from someone with standing to give it, before it would act on anything the archive alone had logged. "Standing," Priya repeated. "Meaning what specifically?" "Meaning you." Wren shook her head, more honestly than she wanted to. "I don't know," is the true answer. The notebook page that would have told me exactly what standing means and how the system verifies it is the one page that's missing, cut out, not torn, cut clean with a blade. And I've always assumed she did that herself, right before she sealed the tunnel, because leaving the full activation procedure sitting in a notebook her own family might find someday was exactly the kind of risk Esme Calloway wouldn't have taken. What I do know is the family name is on the project header in 3 different places I've found. Calloway Doctrine In one early draft title she crossed out. And there's a phrase she uses twice in the margins that I've never fully understood until tonight, watching Archivist Dale stare at that placard like it might bite her. The correction can be answered, but only by someone the ledger will actually hear. I always read that as poetry. I don't think it was poetry. I think it's the actual mechanism, and I think I might be the only living person with even a chance of knowing what it means. And I have absolutely no idea if that chance is real, or if I'm about to find out the hard way that it isn't. The back room was quiet for a long moment, steam ticking as the last of the press heat bled out of the machines, and it was Corvin who finally spoke, in the low, careful voice of a man who had spent 30 years weighing exactly this kind of choice, and had never once found a way to make it feel less like a gamble with someone else's life on the table. "If the Dominion gets that thing fully powered and doesn't know what it's holding," he said, "they're going to treat it like every other piece of captured human hardware they've ever found. They'll scan it, they'll probe it, they'll try to force it open because forcing things open is the only method Orsk's kind of officer has ever needed. And if what you're describing is real, if that system starts compiling an account the second someone forces it awake, and if the account it compiles includes everything that's happened on this coast in the 42 years since the fall, not just the war itself, then whatever answer it settles on isn't going to be small, and it isn't going to be gentle, and it's very likely not going to stop to ask whether the landing, whether Port Meridian is still standing on the ground it's aiming at." "I know," Wren said. "That's why I need to be on that translation team, Priya, not despite what it is, because of it. I'm the only person in this city who might be able to walk into that chamber and stop it from deciding this whole coast owes a debt it can't survive paying." Priya looked at her for a long time, the particular look of a woman who had spent 11 years training this girl for 100 smaller, safer versions of this exact moment, and had never let herself believe it would arrive dressed exactly like this. "Then you're going to tell me everything you learn every single day, and you are not going to try to be a hero inside that building, Wren. You're going to be a translator. A good one, a boring one, the kind nobody looks at twice. Whatever your grandmother built into that system, we are not betting this city on a 19-year-old finding the rest of the instructions by instinct. We work the problem the way we work every problem, patiently, together. And the second it stops being safe for you to be inside that building, you walk out, and we find another way, because I did not raise Esme Calloway's granddaughter just to bury her in the same hole." Wren promised, and meant it, in the specific way you mean a promise you already suspect you won't be able to keep. The Reckoning Corps, Wren had started calling it that in her own head within the first hour of seeing it, unable to make herself use the word ledger inside a building full of people who might notice her flinch at it, occupied the center of a converted archival vault 3 levels below the keep's public wings, a squat, unremarkable column of dark alloy standing 8 feet tall on a raised dais. Ringed by data lecterns, the recovery crew had cannibalized from 3 different pieces of period human hardware, because nothing in the original installation had shipped with a working interface anyone could read without her. Provost-Marshal Orsk had assembled a team of 11 for what he was calling. In every internal memo Wren was required to translate into the Registry filing system, the Meridian Recovery Initiative, 4 weapons assessment engineers, 3 Registry archivists including Dale, 2 garrison technicians, a junior officer named Calix Wren, who Wren would come to understand over the following days, was the only person on the team besides Dale who seemed to feel the weight of what they didn't know. And Orsk himself, who visited the vault twice daily and asked, every single time, some version of the same question: how long until we can turn it on? The weapons assessment came back inconclusive in a way that clearly infuriated him. No armament signature. No propulsion, no power core that matched any known human military standard, nothing that scanned as offensive hardware at all, just the column itself, A vast buried archive of data storage Wren's team was assigned to catalog and translate, and a warning architecture wrapped around all of it that read, page after page, in language that grew more insistent the deeper the team dug, as a legal and procedural framework rather than a weapons manual. Rules of engagement. Standards of evidence. A doctrine of proportionality that ran to 900 pages before Wren stopped counting, cross-referenced against what looked, unmistakably, like case files. Real incidents, real dates, real coordinates, logged and weighted and scored against Esme Calloway's framework one atrocity at a time. "It's not a weapon," Wren said on the fourth day, standing beside Wren at a lectern with the particular exhausted honesty of a junior officer who had stopped performing certainty for his superiors sometime around midnight. "I've read 600 pages of this archive and I haven't found a single line describing a warhead. It reads like," he stopped, searching for a word his own language didn't quite have, "like a tribunal. Like someone built a courtroom and then, somewhere underneath it, wired the verdict directly into something that could enforce itself." "That's an unusual way to describe captured human hardware, Lieutenant," Orsk said from the vault's entrance, and Wren, without turning, felt the whole room's posture change the way it always did when he arrived. "It's the accurate way to describe it, Provost-Marshal, whether or not it's the useful way," Dale said, before Wren had to answer for himself. 900 pages of doctrine, cross-referenced case files running back to the earliest weeks of the fall. Whatever this installation was built to do, it wasn't built to be a bigger gun than the ones humanity already had and lost the war with. It was built to render a judgment. "Then let it render one," Orsk said. "I don't need this team's philosophical assessment of what humanity intended 42 years ago. I need to know whether this installation can be made functional, and I need to know it before the Grand Marshal's fleet review arrives at this sector in 11 days, because I have already sent word up the chain that this recovery is the single most significant piece of captured human infrastructure found on this coast since the fall, and I intend for that word to still be true when Grand Marshal Carr sees it with his own eyes." Wren kept her hands steady on the lectern and her expression at exactly the register the Registry paid her for, and made herself do the arithmetic Priya had trained her to do before she let herself feel anything about it. Grand Marshal Wren Carr. 11 days. The name meant something to every human on this coast old enough to remember the fall's final weeks. The officer who had ordered the strike on the evacuation flotilla in the Meridian shallows, 3,000 civilians in transport boats that had been promised safe passage under a truce flag his own command had negotiated, and then broken without warning. An atrocity so total and so deliberately unnecessary that even Dominion administrators who otherwise avoided the topic entirely referred to it, when they had to, only as the reef. Wren had grown up 2 streets from a memorial wall bearing names her own mother had helped carve, before the reprisal raid that had taken her mother 3 years later for the crime of organizing the carving in the first place. If the ledger was compiling an account, and if Carr's name was anywhere in the case files Wren had spent 4 days reading, then 11 days was not a deadline. It was a countdown to something Wren did not yet have language for, and she left the vault that evening with the specific, focused calm of someone who had just understood exactly how little time she actually had. 2 days after that exchange, Orsk tightened the whole recovery team's security clearance without warning. New badges, new escort protocols between floors, a fresh round of personnel review that pulled every file on every human contractor attached to the Meridian Recovery Initiative, Wren's included, for a re-verification, she was told, by a registry supervisor who clearly believed it, was routine ahead of a Grand Marshal's visit and nothing more. She spent the better part of an afternoon rehearsing, in the privacy of her own skull, exactly which version of her employment history would survive a board clerk's crosscheck and which would not, and told herself, when the badge came back reissued without comment, that routine was still, for now, precisely what it had been. It was Wren who found her afterward, in the translation office 2 floors above the vault. Long past the end of a shift, neither of them had actually finished, and set down 2 cups of the bitter garrison-issue tea that passed for hospitality inside the keep without being asked. He looked, Wren thought, like a man who had not slept properly since Ilst's incident report crossed his desk, and for a while he didn't say anything at all, just turned his own cup slowly between his hands, the way people did when they were deciding how much of themselves to hand a stranger. "My cousin served on Ashenmore," he said finally, not looking at her. "Garrison duty, nothing glamorous, 4 years running supply convoys through a tribute district that never gave anyone trouble. She used to write that the quiet ones frightened her more than the ones that fought back, because you never knew what the quiet was actually costing them to keep." He glanced at the case file summaries still open on his lectern, the names and dates Wren had spent 4 days helping him translate into a language his own command structure could file, and she suspected, quietly Barry. "I keep thinking about how many pages of that archive are just quiet, compliance, logged as a virtue, and how much of what we call pacification only looks like peace from exactly the angle we're standing at." He looked up at her then, and there was nothing accusing in it, only a tiredness that made him, for a moment, feel less like an officer of an occupying garrison and more like a young man watching a version of history close in on him that he had never signed up to be part of. "You've read more of this than I have, linguist. Tell me honestly, does it get worse the deeper in we go?" Wren chose her answer the way she chose every answer inside that building, carefully and true as far as it could safely go. "I think it gets more specific," she said. "I don't think specific and worse are always the same thing, Lieutenant. Sometimes specific is the only thing standing between a mistake and a massacre." She held his gaze a moment longer than the registry paid her to. "I'd hold on to that thought if I were you. I have a feeling it's going to matter more than either of us expects before this is finished." Wren didn't ask her what she meant. He only nodded slowly and drank the last of his tea, and neither of them spoke of it again. But Wren carried the exchange with her for the rest of that night, turning it over the way Priya had taught her to turn over anything that might, eventually, decide who lived. She found the trigger 3 days later, and found it because Orsk found it first. Frustrated by a week of inconclusive scans and a fleet review closing fast, Orsk had authorized what the assessment team's internal logs called an active interrogation protocol. Not a physical breach, not yet, but a full-spectrum diagnostic push through every data port the recovery crew's cannibalized lecterns could reach. An attempt to force the archive to respond to direct query instead of sitting passively under passive scan. Wren was in the vault when it happened, translating a case file cross-reference at a side lectern, and felt rather than saw the column's ambient hum change register. A shift so faint that Wren, standing closer, noticed it half a second before the first lectern screen flickered from gray to a soft, steady green. "Intake open," the screen read, in human military shorthand that took Wren exactly 1 heartbeat to translate and every ounce of her training not to react to. "Compiling testimony. Verdict lock in 33,0000. "Report," Orsk said, already moving toward the dais, and Wren, scrambling to make sense of a data stream that had gone from dormant to torrential in under a second, gave him the honest version before anyone thought to filter it. "It's building something, Provost-Marshal. A compilation of some kind, pulling from every file the archive already holds and cross-indexing it against live data from the diagnostic push we just ran. There's a counter." He looked up, and Wren watched him do the same arithmetic she had already finished doing, 3 seconds slower and considerably more visibly. 33 hours. Whatever it's compiling, it looks like it intends to finish in 33 hours. "Translate the header for me, linguist," Orsk said, not looking at Wren, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Now." Wren stepped forward and gave him the truth, because there was no version of a lie that would survive the next 33 hours intact, and she needed him to trust her translations completely for exactly as long as it took her to find a way out of this. Intake open. Compiling testimony. Verdict lock in 33 hours. She let the silence sit for exactly as long as a professional linguist delivering an unwelcome finding would let it sit. Provost-Marshal, based on the doctrine archive my team has spent a week translating, I believe this system is compiling evidence towards some kind of formal judgment, and I believe it intends to finalize that judgment in 33 hours, whether or not anyone in this room understands what triggered it. Can it be stopped? I don't know, Wren said, which was true, and which was also the single most dangerous sentence she had spoken since she was 17 years old, because the honest answer beneath it. I might be the only person alive who could stop it, and I have no intention of telling you that sat behind her eyes with a weight she had to work, consciously, not to let show. Orsk stared at the screen for a long moment, and Wren watched something shift in his posture that she recognized immediately, because she had watched it shift in a dozen registry supervisors over 3 years of translation work. The specific transition from a man managing a discovery to a man managing a crisis, and the specific, dangerous confidence with which a man like Orsk always chose to manage a crisis by forcing it rather than understanding it. Then we accelerate, he said. Whatever this is compiling, it started compiling because we asked it a question. I want every remaining diagnostic protocol run in parallel, full spectrum, no restraint. If it's building toward a verdict, I want to know what that verdict is, and I want to know it before this counter reaches 0, because I am not walking Grand Marshal car into a chamber holding an active countdown I cannot explain to him. He turned to Dale. Full team, round the clock, until verdict lock, or until we understand what we're looking at. Whichever comes first. It came first, and it came badly on the second night of the countdown, when a garrison technician named Pharaoh Ilst. Wren would learn his name only because she would spend the rest of that night translating the incident report that used it, attempted to physically bypass a locked interface panel on the column's lower housing using a breach tool the recovery crew had brought for exactly this contingency. And the column answered the attempt with a discharge that killed him instantly and put 2 more technicians in the base's medical bay with burns down one side of their bodies that would take months to heal. Wren was not in the vault when it happened. She heard the alarm from the translation office 2 floors up, felt the whole building's power flicker once, hard, in a surge that reached even the civilian grid 3 blocks away. Priya would tell her later, grim-faced, that half of Port Meridian's residential sector had lost lights for exactly 4 seconds at 2:47 in the morning, and that every household old enough to remember the fall had lain awake afterward, certain. In the particular bone-deep way occupied people are always certain of bad news, that something enormous had just happened somewhere close. She reached the vault 20 minutes later, summoned along with the rest of the translation team for an emergency briefing, and found Orsk standing at the dais rail with his jaw set, and his hands locked behind his back in a stillness that Wren, watching him for 3 years of registry briefings, understood immediately as barely contained fury directed entirely at himself, and with nowhere safe to land. The system logged the breach attempt as an unauthorized override and answered it, Wren reported, his voice unsteady in a way Wren had never heard from him before. The discharge was localized, targeted specifically at the point of physical contact. It didn't touch anyone else in the vault. It didn't damage any of our equipment. It answered exactly the threat it was given and nothing more. He looked up at Orsk, and something in his face made Wren's stomach go cold, because it was the look of a man forcing himself to say something his superior did not want to hear. Provost-Marshal, I don't think this was a malfunction. I think it was restraint. I think whatever built this system designed it to answer force with exactly the amount of force the situation required, and no more. And I think that should terrify us considerably more than a malfunction would. It killed Ilst. Ilst tried to force open a locked door on an active weapons system mid-countdown, Wren said. I'm not defending what happened to him. I'm telling you what the data shows because you asked me to, and because I think the alternative, assuming it was an accident, a fluke, a system firing wild, is going to get more of us killed a great deal faster than the truth will." Orsk was silent for a long moment, looking at the column at the counter on the lectern screen, which read, when Wren finally let herself look at it, "Verdict lock in 21:14:07. "Then we stop trying to force it open," he said finally, "and we start trying to understand what it wants, because I have 11 days becoming considerably fewer hours to explain to Grand Marshal Carr why a piece of captured human hardware killed one of my technicians, and we don't know is not an answer that survives contact with that man." He turned, and his eyes found Wren's across the vault and held there a fraction of a second longer than they ever had before. "Linguist, you've read more of that doctrine archive than anyone else on this team. If this system is building toward a formal judgment the way your translations keep suggesting, then judgments require terms, standing to be heard, evidence admitted, evidence excluded. Find me the terms. Find me who this thing is actually willing to listen to, because if I can't force it open, I intend to talk my way in instead." Wren spent the next 6 hours doing exactly what he asked, translating deeper into the doctrine archive than she had let herself go before, in front of witnesses, because the alternative, refusing, or visibly stalling, was a risk she could not afford with Orsk's attention now fixed on her specifically. She found and translated aloud for Wren's incident log, 3 pages describing an evidentiary framework that any legal system might have recognized. Standards of proof, chain of custody for logged incidents, procedures for cross-examination of compiled testimony. She found, and did not translate aloud, a 4th page buried deeper than the others, formatted differently, clearly added after the rest of the archive was finalized. That described something called witness correction, a narrow procedural window in which a verified human witness could appear before the system prior to verdict lock and submit testimony that would be weighed against, and could substantially revise whatever the compiled archive alone had determined. The page did not say how a witness was verified. It did not say who qualified. It ended instead with a line Wren recognized before she finished translating it in her own head, because it was the same hand, the same phrasing, the same careful, deliberate restraint that ran through every page of her grandmother's notebook. "The ledger will know its own when it hears them." She photographed the page on the same personal device she was not permitted to carry, exactly as she had photographed the placard 3 weeks earlier, and this time she did not tell herself the omission was professional discretion. She told herself, walking home through curfew-empty streets at 4 in the morning with 19 hours left on a countdown that might end with half of Port Meridian dead, that it was the only choice left that gave anyone a chance at all, and she let that be enough, because it had to be. Priya read the photograph twice in the back room of the laundry, with Corvin standing over her shoulder, and the steam presses cold and silent, because it was too close to curfew to risk the noise. "The ledger will know its own when it hears them," Priya read aloud. "That's not a security protocol, Wren. That's not biometric verification or a coded phrase. That reads like something a person wrote when they trusted a system to recognize sincerity rather than credentials. And I don't know how you prove sincerity to a machine, but I know exactly how you don't. You don't prove it standing next to the man who murdered a technician trying to force it open 8 hours ago." "I know." 19 hours, Corvin said low. "And the Corps 3 levels under an occupied administrative keep, behind a security perimeter that's tripled since Ilse died, and every soul on that translation team is being watched twice as hard as they were a week ago, including you." He looked at Wren for a long moment, the look of a man doing arithmetic he badly wanted to come out differently than it was coming out. "There's a maintenance access your grandmother's own notebook describes, doesn't there? Somewhere on that page you haven't shown me the whole of." Wren nodded, and pulled the notebook photograph up beside the new one, the 2 pages side by side on the cracked screen of a device that had already put her life in danger twice tonight, and was about to do it a 3rd time. There's a service corridor that ran under the original rail yard, parallel to the main access shaft, built into the original installation and never logged on any Dominion survey because it was sealed with a false collapse. The same trick as the tunnel roof, just smaller, meant to look like ordinary subsidence instead of a deliberate cave-in. If the keep's foundations sit where I think they sit relative to the old rail bed, that corridor should terminate somewhere beneath the keep's sublevels, close to the vault, maybe close enough to reach without going through the main security perimeter at all. She looked up. It's a guess built on a 42-year-old diagram and a location I've never actually seen. It might not exist anymore. It might have collapsed for real sometime in the last 4 decades. I don't have another guess, Priya. I have 19 hours and 1 door nobody's watching, or I have nothing. Then we find out if the door's real, Priya said, already moving, already reaching for the map case she kept behind the laundry's false wall, and Corvin was moving with her. And for the next 4 hours the 3 of them worked the way Priya had always taught Wren to work a problem, patiently, methodically. Cross-referencing 42-year-old rail survey diagrams against modern keep foundation plans, a resistance contact inside the city planning office had smuggled out 18 months ago for an entirely different purpose. Until, at 8:30 in the morning with 11 hours left on the counter, Corvin looked up from the overlaid maps with the grim, focused certainty of a man who had found exactly what he was looking for and did not like where it led. "It's real," he said. Or it was. The corridor terminates in a maintenance sublevel directly beneath the keep's East Archive wing, which is the same wing your vault sits in, Wren, 1 level down. There's an access point in the old rail yard itself. Inside the fenced recovery site the Dominion's still actively working, which means getting to the door means walking past however much security Orsk's put around that tunnel mouth since the breach. He tapped the map. And even if the door's there, even if it's not collapsed, you're talking about a service corridor nobody has walked in 42 years. You don't know what's waiting in it. You don't know if it still connects all the way through. You don't know if there's a second door on the far end you can even open. "I know I have 11 hours, Wren said, "and I know what happens to this city if I don't try." They did not sleep. Priya spent the morning building the only diversion she could put together on 11 hours' notice. A coordinated substation fault 3 streets from the recovery site. Time to draw the site's reserve security detail away for the 20 minutes it would take Corvin to get Wren past the fence in a maintenance uniform borrowed from a laundry customer who owed Priya more favors than either of them had ever counted. And Wren spent the morning translating in the vault, under Orsk's increasingly desperate watch, doing the only thing she could do to buy the diversion time, telling him honestly that the witness correction procedure existed, and telling him dishonestly that she had no idea how it worked or who it might accept, and watching him decide, exactly as she had hoped he would, that if a witness was required, he would simply have to find one, and that the obvious candidate was a Dominion officer with the standing and the nerve to face the system, directly rather than a translator he had started in the last 2 days to watch a fraction too closely. The substation fault went off at 1:40 in the afternoon, 11 hours and 40 minutes into a 21-hour countdown that had somehow, impossibly, compressed itself into a race Wren was going to run with barely enough daylight left to see the finish line, and she left the translation office on a fabricated equipment errand, met Corvin 3 streets over in a maintenance transport that smelled of machine oil and old rain, and rode with him to the rail yard fence in a silence neither of them tried to fill. The recovery site's reserve security detail was thin and distracted, exactly as Priya had promised, chasing a substation fault that would resolve itself, mysteriously, the moment it had served its purpose, and Corvin walked Wren through the outer fence in a maintenance uniform 2 sizes too large, past a security post manned by a single bored technician who barely glanced at credentials Corvin had built well enough to survive that glance and no more. To the mouth of the old tunnel where the crates had come up 3 weeks ago, and down a side access nobody had bothered to seal because nobody but the two of them and a 42-year-old survey diagram knew it led anywhere at all. The corridor was there. It had held mostly 100 meters of narrow service passage, water-stained and choked with dust that had settled undisturbed for 4 decades. One section collapsed enough that Wren had to go through on her hands and knees, dragging her satchel behind her, while Corvin worked the rubble loose behind her with a hand pry bar, and the specific silent patience of a man who had done far more dangerous things than this in a much longer war than the one Wren had grown up inside. It took them 90 minutes to cover 100 meters, and at the far end, exactly where the overlaid maps had promised it, was a second door, smaller than the tunnel's main access hatch, unmarked except for a single stenciled line that made Wren's breath catch even after everything else tonight. CLLOWAY. Service access only. Somewhere behind them, deeper in the collapsed section, a slow trickle of settling dust hissed down through a crack neither of them had noticed, until the sound of it stopped them both cold. And for a long, silent moment they crouched in the dark and waited to find out whether the whole corridor had decided, 42 years late, to finish collapsing on top of them. It didn't. The trickle thinned and stopped, and Corvin let out a breath through his teeth and kept working the pry bar with the same unhurried patience he'd shown for the last 90 minutes, because panic, he'd told Wren once, years ago, was just another kind of noise, and noise was the one thing neither of them could afford down here. When the last of the rubble finally gave way, and the passage opened into clear tunnel again, Wren's hands were shaking in a way she hadn't let them shake since the transport ride to the rail yards 3 weeks earlier, and she made herself breathe until they stopped, because whatever waited at the far end of this corridor was not going to wait for her to be less afraid before it asked something of her. "She really did build it for you," Corvin said quietly, looking at the stencil. "Not for the Registry, not for whoever won the war. For whoever came after her from her own line, if it ever needed opening again." Wren put her hand flat against the door's cold surface for a moment, and let herself feel, for exactly as long as she had time to feel anything, the specific vertigo of standing somewhere her grandmother had stood 42 years ago, sealing a door she must have known even then that she would never live to see opened again. Then she found the release mechanism Esme's notebook had described in its last surviving page, a manual override keyed not to any biometric scan, but to a sequence of pressure points that spelled, in the old tactile alphabet soldiers used in the dark, a phrase Wren had known since she was small enough to trace it with her grandmother's hand guiding her own, and the door opened onto a narrow stairwell that climbed, dust-thick and utterly silent, directly up into the vault's sublevel. 40 meters and one door away from the reckoning core, and a countdown that had, by the time she checked her wrist chrono in the stairwell's dark, 6 hours and 11 minutes left to run. She had expected the sublevel to be empty. It wasn't. Provost-Marshal Draven Orsk was standing at the base of the dais when Wren came through the maintenance hatch at the sublevel's far end, alone. No security detail, no translation team, just Orsk and the column and a portable transmitter unit he had clearly brought down himself and set up without informing anyone above him. And Wren understood, in the half-second before he turned and saw her, exactly what she was looking at. A man who had run out of every legitimate option, with 6 hours left before a countdown he could not stop, and could not explain to a Grand Marshal already inbound for a fleet review, deciding to solve his career the same way he had solved every problem in 11 years of garrison postings. Alone, unsanctioned, and by force. Linguist. Orsk's voice was flat, controlled, and underneath the control, Wren heard something she had never heard from him before, in 3 years of registry work and 3 weeks inside his recovery team: real fear, tightly bound. You're a long way from your translation desk, and that access route isn't on any survey I've ever approved." His eyes went to the maintenance hatch behind her, to the dust still clinging to her sleeves, and something clicked into place behind his expression that Wren watched happen in real time and could do nothing to stop. "Calloway," he said slowly, as though testing the shape of a word he'd read once in a personnel file and dismissed as coincidence. "That's your name. And there's a name stamped on 3 separate documents inside this archive. Buried under 42 years of translation the registry never flagged because none of us thought to check a linguist's file against a dead engineer's. Calloway Doctrine." His hand moved slowly toward the sidearm at his hip, not drawing it, just resting there, the specific, deliberate gesture of a man reminding both of them that the option existed. "Tell me I'm wrong." "You're not wrong," Wren said, because there was no version of this conversation where a lie survived the next 60 seconds, and because the counter on the lectern screen behind him read 5 hours and 58 minutes, and she did not have time left to spend on anything but the truth. "My grandmother built this system. I've known what it was since I was old enough to read her handwriting. I came down here because I think I might be the only person alive who can stop it from doing what it's about to do to this entire coast, and I need you to let me try, because if you stop me, Provost-Marshal, I don't think either of us survives what happens at 0. Orsk stared at her for a long, silent moment, the transmitter unit humming faintly on the floor between them, and Wren watched him do the same arithmetic every Dominion officer she had ever met eventually did, the arithmetic of a man weighing his career against his survival and discovering, usually too late, that the two had stopped being the same calculation. "I already tried to activate the witness correction procedure myself," he said finally, and there was something almost like relief in his voice, buried under the fear, the relief of a man finally admitting a failure he had spent 5 hours trying alone. 2 hours ago, I stood exactly where you're standing and gave that thing every credential the Dominion has ever issued me: command authority, service record, direct testimony to context it clearly already had logged. It rejected all of it. Not with force, with silence. The counter kept running and nothing else happened, and I have been standing here for 2 hours trying to understand what I did wrong, because I do not have another plan, linguist, and I am not too proud to admit that I need whatever you know that I don't." "You gave it credentials," Wren said, and something in her chest that had been coiled tight since the moment she saw the placard in a rain-soaked tunnel 3 weeks ago finally, slightly, began to loosen because she understood, standing here, exactly what her grandmother had built and exactly why a man like Orsk had never had a chance of reaching it. "It doesn't want credentials, Provost-Marshal. It was never built to answer to authority. That was the entire point. My grandmother spent 2 years writing a doctrine specifically, so this system would never again be a weapon that simply obeyed whoever was strongest or loudest or most convinced of their own right to command it. It wants testimony. Truth, freely given from someone with genuine standing to give it, and genuine standing isn't rank. It's proximity to the actual account. It's someone who lived what's logged in that archive, or someone directly descended from the person who built the framework to weigh it. You have neither." She stepped past him, toward the dais, toward the column, toward a counter reading 5 hours and 51 minutes, and did not look back to see whether he reached for the sidearm at his hip, because there was nothing she could do about that decision now except keep walking and hope the last 3 weeks had taught him enough about what this room could do to a man who chose force over understanding. He did not reach for it. He stood where he was and watched her climb the dais steps and said nothing at all, and Wren would spend a long time afterward wondering whether that silence was surrender or curiosity or simply the specific exhaustion of a man who had finally run out of better ideas than trusting the one person in the room who actually knew what she was doing. The interface at the column's base was simpler than 3 weeks of translation work had led Wren to expect: a single flat plate, unmarked except for a shallow recessed handprint outline, and a small screen above it that had shifted, sometime in the last hour, From the compiling status she'd grown used to seeing to a single steady line. Witness correction available. Awaiting testimony. She put her hand into the recessed outline and felt, rather than heard, something in the column shift. Not a sound exactly, more a change in the quality of the silence around her. The specific attentive stillness of a very large, very old system deciding to listen. "My name is Wren Calloway," she said, and her voice in the vault's dead air sounded steadier than she felt, which was, she thought distantly, exactly the voice Priya had spent 11 years training into her. "I'm Esme Calloway's granddaughter. I don't know if that means anything to whatever's listening, or if it should. I know what you were built to do because she wrote it down, and I've read every word of it more times than I can count. I know you've spent," she glanced, involuntarily at the counter, 39 hours compiling an account of everything logged against this coast since the day my grandmother sealed you underground. And I know that account is going to include things that happened before I was born, and things that happened to my own family. And if I'm honest with you, some part of me has wanted exactly what you're about to do since I was old enough to understand what a reprisal raid was. But my grandmother didn't build you for what I want. She built you for what's true, and what's true is that this city is still full of people who had nothing to do with any of it, human and otherwise. And if you settle a debt this large blind, you're going to take them with it, and that isn't justice. That's just a bigger version of exactly what was done to us. She wrote that restraint was the whole point. I'm asking you to remember that, because I don't think I have the standing to ask you for anything else." The screen held its single steady line for 3 full seconds, 3 seconds that felt, to Wren, standing with her hand in a shape her grandmother's hand had once fit exactly, like the longest measurement of time she had ever experienced. And then the line changed. Testimony received. Standing confirmed. Compiled account available for review prior to correction. The screen filled, and Wren made herself read it, every line, because her grandmother had built restraint into this system on the theory that someone would eventually have to look the whole account in the face before deciding what to do with it. And Wren understood, reading it, that the someone was her. The account ran longer than she had braced for. Not the whole war. The system had clearly weighted older incidents lower, discounted by 4 decades of distance the way any honest doctrine of proportionality would have to, unless a specific individual's ongoing culpability kept an old crime current. Grand Marshal Draven Orsk's name appeared first and heaviest, the reef strike logged in exhaustive, sourced, unbearable detail. 3,041 names, cross-referenced against a truce agreement his own command had signed 6 hours before ordering the strike that broke it. And beneath that entry, a second, more recent thread Wren hadn't known existed until this moment. Carr's direct, continuing authorization, over 4 decades, of the cradle reprisal doctrine used across a dozen tribute worlds on this arm of the frontier, including, 3 years ago, on Port Meridian, including, in a line that made Wren's vision blur for exactly 1 unsteady second before she forced it clear, the raid that had taken her mother. Provost-Marshal Draven Orsk's name appeared too, lower on the account but present, waited for the death of Pharaoh Ilst, not as an accusation against Orsk for the killing itself. The system's own logic noted with a coldness Wren found almost merciful, but for the pattern of unauthorized forcing that had produced it. 3 separate documented incidents of Orsk overriding cautionary counsel from his own team in pursuit of a result he wanted rather than one the evidence supported. A pattern the system flagged as directly contributory, and therefore answerable. Archivist Severin Dale's name appeared once, in a note attached almost as an aside, and it was not weighted against her at all. Flagged, repeated documented caution, overruled. Recommend exclusion from correction. Calix Wren's name appeared the same way, flagged with a note Wren read twice to be certain she'd understood it correctly, questioned scope of tampering. Cousin's Ashenmore service record consulted for context, recommend exclusion, and understood, reading it, that some part of this system had been listening to a great deal more than a countdown while it compiled. So Wren saw, scrolling further, did the names of every human household on this coast, every civilian address, every school and hospital and residential block the compiled targeting data might otherwise have swept up in an undifferentiated response. Flagged, individually, one by one, thousands of names her grandmother's doctrine had apparently insisted the system verify and exclude rather than simply assume were safe. Further down the account, weighted lighter than cars but present all the same, Wren found 3 other names she recognized only from the case files Wren had translated with her. A sector logistics officer who had signed off on the requisition orders for the cradle reprisal doctrine without ever once querying its terms. A garrison magistrate who had presided over 11 summary tribunals on Port Meridian in the years since Wren's mother's death and never once returned a verdict the occupation hadn't already written for him. And a name Wren did not recognize at all, cross-referenced against a coordinate 300 kilometers up the coast. An incident the archive summarized in 6 clinical lines that described, without embellishment, the kind of morning that ended a family. Each entry carried its own weighing, its own sourcing, its own note on what had been proven and what had merely been alleged and therefore excluded no matter how badly, reading it, Wren wanted it included. It was, she understood, watching the account scroll past her in the vault's cold light, exactly what her grandmother had promised in a notebook margin 30 years before Wren was born. A debt measured, not a debt imagined. It would have taken hours to read every line, and she did not have hours. She had, when she finally made herself look away from the account and back at the counter, 4 minutes. "I don't have time to weigh all of this the way it deserves," she said, and her voice was not steady anymore, not entirely, and she let it not be, because there was no one left in this room to perform composure for. "But I don't think I need to. You've already done the weighing. I'm not here to argue with an account that's more honest than anything I could have written myself. I'm here to confirm it and to ask for exactly one thing beyond what's already logged, that whatever correction you deliver, it answers the names that earned it, and it leaves everyone else exactly where they're standing right now. My grandmother built you to be precise. I'm asking you to be precise. That's the whole of my testimony. That's all the standing I have to give." "Correction confirmed," the screen read. "Executing." Behind her, Provost-Marshal Orsk made a sound that was not quite a word, and Wren turned in time to see him take one step backward from the dais, one hand raised in a gesture that might have been surrender or might simply have been the last instinct of a man understanding. Too late. Exactly what he had spent 3 weeks trying to force open. The column's ambient hum shifted again, deeper this time, a sound Wren felt in the floor beneath her boots more than she heard it, and somewhere far above them, in orbit 200 kilometers over Port Meridian, a debris field the Dominion's own surveys had catalogued for 42 years as harmless wreckage from a battle nobody living remembered woke up and began, very precisely, to move. Grand Marshal Vesenkar's flagship, the Sovereign Doctrine, was 6 hours out from Port Meridian orbit, running a scheduled approach for a fleet review that had been on his calendar for 11 months, when the first of what his tactical officers would later describe, in a report nobody above Subfleet Command ever fully believed, as impossible objects began deviating from catalogued debris trajectories that had not changed in 4 decades. There was no warning transmission. There was no demand, no ultimatum, no voice on any channel explaining what was happening or why. There was simply a field of what every sensor aboard the Sovereign Doctrine had spent its entire operational life logging as inert wreckage, moving now with a coordinated, silent precision that read, to the handful of officers watching it happen in real time, less like an attack than like a verdict already rendered, and simply, finally, being carried out. The strike that found the Sovereign Doctrine 40 minutes later did not touch its escort screen. It did not touch the 3 support vessels running formation half a kilometer off its flank, did not touch the sector relay station monitoring the approach, did not touch a single ship or station or soul that the compiled account had not, individually, weighed and named. It found Grand Marshal Carr's flagship, and it found it with a precision that every subsequent Dominion inquiry would spend years failing to adequately explain, because the honest explanation that something built by a defeated species 4 decades ago had looked at exactly one ship, weighed exactly what its commander had done and continued authorizing, and answered exactly that, and nothing more, was not an explanation any inquiry board wanted written into a permanent record. Every screen on Port Meridian's Dominion administrative network, tied by standing protocol into the sector's emergency broadcast relay, carried the strike live, unfiltered, the way every screen across a dozen tribute worlds on this frontier arm would carry the recording within hours, because the relay that broadcast it was the same relay the Dominion had spent 42 years using to broadcast its own authority to every world it ruled. And the ledger, Wren understood. Standing in a vault 3 levels underground and watching the column screen display a final line of confirmed correction, had simply used the Empire's own voice to deliver the only verdict that had ever mattered to it. In the sub-level vault in the same instant, a second, smaller correction executed with none of the visible spectacle unfolding 200 kilometers overhead. No strike, no flame, nothing a distant camera could have caught. Provost-Marshal Draven Orsk simply stopped moving, mid-step, his raised hand falling slowly back to his side, his uniform's command insignia, the specific badge of rank that had authorized 3 documented overrides of his own team's caution, going dark where it sat pinned to his chest. Its embedded authentication chip burned dead by a discharge so localized and so precisely calibrated that it left every other thread on his uniform, every centimeter of skin an inch to either side. Entirely untouched, he did not fall. He stood, breathing, alive, and utterly, permanently stripped of every command authority the Dominion had ever granted him, and looked at Wren across the vault with an expression she would spend a long time afterward trying to name, and never quite managing to, because it was not hatred, and it was not fear anymore, either. It was closer, she decided eventually, to the specific, hollowed-out look of a man who had spent his entire career believing that force solved every problem that mattered, standing in the wreckage of the one problem it hadn't, with just enough left of himself to understand exactly how much of the wreckage was his own making. "It didn't kill you," she said, when the silence had stretched long enough that someone needed to break it, and her own voice sounded strange to her, flattened by 3 weeks of exhaustion finally catching up all at once. "It could have. It didn't. I don't think that was mercy, Provost-Marshal. I think it was precision. You forced things open that killed a man under your own command. It answered that, and only that, and I think it left you standing specifically so that every officer in this sector would have to look at you for the rest of your career and understand exactly what happens to authority that outruns its own judgment." Orsk did not answer her. He turned instead without a word and walked toward the vault's main access, past Wren and Dale and a security detail that had finally arrived, 90 seconds too late to matter, and Wren understood, watching him go, that whatever came next for Draven Orsk, inquiry, reassignment, the slow professional death of an officer whose signature discovery had ended his career instead of building it, was no longer any part of the account she had been asked to weigh. The counter on the lectern screen, when Wren finally let herself look at it, read 0, and beneath the 0, a final line she translated silently, for no one but herself, standing alone at last in a vault her grandmother had built and sealed and trusted, across 42 years and an entire lost war, to someone she would never live to meet. Account settled, returning to dormant state. Archivist Severin Dale found her there 10 minutes later, when the rest of the vault had emptied into the chaos spreading through every level of the keep above them, and stood at the base of the dais for a long moment without speaking, looking at Wren, and at the column, and at the stencil on a maintenance hatch behind her that read, unmistakably now, CALLOWAY. "I'm not going to report what I think I just watched happen," Dale said finally, carefully, in the flat, professional register of a woman who had spent 30 years learning exactly when flatness was a mercy. "I don't fully understand it, and I suspect that if I tried to write it down honestly, no inquiry board above me would believe it anyway. What I am going to report is that the recovered installation executed an autonomous defensive response to unauthorized tampering, consistent with the warning architecture we translated from the outset, and that Provost-Marshal Orsk's command authority was compromised in the incident. That's true. It's just not the whole truth, and I think you and I both know which parts I'm choosing to leave out." She looked at Wren for a long moment. "Whatever standing you had to walk into this room, linguist, I don't think it's mine to ask about. I think it's yours to keep." Wren said nothing because there was nothing safe to say, and Dale did not wait for an answer. She turned and left the vault the way she had entered it 3 weeks ago, cautious, methodical, and this time, Wren thought, watching her go, considerably wiser than any of the reports she was about to file would ever admit. The city that woke to the broadcast the next morning was not, in any way Wren could have predicted 3 weeks earlier, a free one. The Dominion's garrison remained. The curfew remained. The Registry building reopened for its normal shift within 36 hours, and Wren reported to her translation desk on schedule, because the alternative, drawing attention to an absence that would beg exactly the question she had spent 3 weeks avoiding, was not a risk either she or Priya was willing to take. But something in the texture of the occupation had shifted, subtly, in ways that would take months to fully surface. A new caution in how Dominion administrators issued orders they might once have issued without a second thought. A new hesitation, citywide, that Wren watched settle over Port Meridian's garrison in the weeks that followed. The specific unease of an occupying force that had just learned, in the most public way possible, that some of what it had buried and forgotten was neither buried nor forgotten at all. The formal inquiry into the loss of the sovereign doctrine convened in the core worlds 4 months later and produced, in the end, exactly the kind of answer institutions produce when the true answer is unacceptable to everyone empowered to hear it. A finding of catastrophic and unexplained debris field anomaly, no fault assigned, no further investigation recommended. A conclusion Wren read in translation 2 years afterward in a leaked summary Priya's network had spent a small fortune acquiring, and understood, reading it, as its own kind of confession. Nobody in the Dominion's chain of command wanted to write down, in a permanent record, that a defeated species had built a court 42 years ago and quietly, patiently won a case in it. Word still moved anyway, the way it always did among people who had learned to read a silence for what it withheld rather than what it said. Corvin heard it first, months later, through the same slow chain of contacts that had once carried news of the fall itself, that on at least 3 other tribute worlds along the frontier arm the broadcast had reached, garrison administrations had quietly, without explanation, begun revising reprisal doctrines that had stood unchallenged for decades. The specific bureaucratic caution of officers who had watched, on their own screens, exactly what an old debt looked like when it finally came due. Calix Wren stayed on with the Registry Archive Division for another year before requesting a transfer off-world, a request Wren learned about only second-hand, through Dale, in a conversation neither of them fully finished. Dale herself never asked Wren another direct question about that night, in 3 more years of shared translation work, though she brought her twice, cases from the wider archive that any other archivist would have simply filed and forgotten. A magistrate's file with an inconsistency worth flagging, a requisition order worth quietly slowing down, with no explanation offered and none requested, 2 women who had decided, without ever saying so aloud, that some debts were worth tending even when nothing large enough to settle them was listening. Priya found her that evening in the back room of the laundry, steam presses running again, ordinary noise filling a space that had held nothing but careful whispers for 3 weeks, and did not ask her to recount the whole of it, because Wren had already told her everything on the walk home, in the flat, exhausted voice of someone who had used up every reserve of composure she had, and was running now on nothing but momentum. "You did what she built you to do," Priya said, when the silence had gone on long enough. "Not what you wanted, what was true. That's harder, Wren, and it's rarer, and I don't think there's a person on this coast who could have stood in that room and done it the way you did." "I keep thinking about the names it excluded," Wren said. "Dale, Rahan. Every household on this street. It would have been so easy for something built out of 42 years of grief to just take all of it, everyone, everything with a Dominion badge anywhere near it. It didn't. It found exactly what earned the account and left the rest of us standing." She looked down at her hands, steady now in a way they hadn't been in the vault, steady the way Priya had spent 11 years teaching her to be. "I think that's what she actually built, Priya. Not a bigger gun. A promise that we'd still know the difference, even after everything, between an enemy and just someone standing too close to one." 2 weeks later, on a morning bright enough to make the memorial wall's carved names glow faintly gold in the early light, Wren walked the 2 streets from her apartment to the wall her mother had helped build, and stood in front of it the way she had stood in front of it every year on this date since she was old enough to walk there alone, and found, beside her mother's name, a small, new addition someone in the city's quiet resistance network had carved sometime in the last 2 weeks without asking anyone's permission. A second name, smaller, set slightly apart, that read simply, ECALLOWAY. She kept her word. Wren stood there for a long time, in air that smelled faintly of salt and old rain, in a city still occupied and still, in every way that mattered on any given ordinary day, unfree, and let herself feel, for the first time in 3 weeks, something that was not fear, and was not grief exactly either. It was closer, she thought, to the specific, hard-earned quiet of a debt finally, honestly settled, and a promise, kept across 42 years and one impossible night, by the only 2 people who had ever actually understood what it was for. She did not know, standing there, whether the Dominion would ever find its way back down to that vault, whether some future officer with Orsk's ambition and none of his caution would try again to force open what her grandmother had built. She knew only that if they did, the account would still be there, patient and precise and utterly indifferent to rank, waiting the way it had always waited, not for a weapon to be needed, but for someone with the standing to tell it the truth. And she knew, walking home through streets that were, this morning, exactly as occupied and exactly as unbroken as they had been the morning before, that whoever came looking for it next would find, stamped into steel in her grandmother's own steady hand, precisely the warning it deserved. "It won't ask twice,"